Hey, friends. You probably are going, Keith, where are you? Are you in a new place? Because I've been releasing videos from this really cool, epic studio down here. We're in Steubenville for the Catholic Creator Conference. And I am so excited today to sit down with my friend, Mr. Joe Heschmeyer from Catholic Answers. Now, when I first met Joe, he wasn't working for Catholic Answers. He was just a dude in Kansas City just hanging out, right? And now look at him. He's like one of the leading apologists on YouTube and is spreading the gospel everywhere. I'm so proud of him, and it's been great to see him continue to grow. And when Joe asked, told me he was going to be here, I was like, hey, man, could we sit down and just have a chat? And he graciously agreed to do that, even though he's got many, many things to do today and many people to talk to. So I'm just thankful for the opportunity to hang with you, Joe.
The pleasure is mine. I mean, as you say, I think the first time we hung out was 2020, 2021,
I think it was 2021. It was actually our very first rosary trip that we took.
Yeah.
You were the first stop ever in Kansas City. Remember, It was raining that day. We prayed the rosary in that church together.
And Blessed Sacrament in Kansas City, Kansas, I believe.
Yeah, and it was great. And I remember, like, that was the first stop we ever made, and you know, that ministry has grown like crazy.
Yes,
we travel the world now, and there are thousands of people part of that, which is awesome. But man, you've been a busy boy.
We both have been.
Yeah.
Just listening to your schedule before we started recording, just how often you're doing, you know, the daily rosary and then having weekly and bi-weekly stuff. I mean, it's amazing to see how the Lord has blessed you, and it's been amazing to be part of what the Lord's been doing in my own life as well, in terms of working for Catholic Answers and writing books and doing all this stuff with, growing Shameless Popery as a channel. It's been a real journey, really a tremendously blessed journey in ways that I wouldn't have ever expected or predicted.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
You know, when you became an apologist for Catholic Answers, what's different about what you expected versus reality?
That's a great question. So I'd say first, like, the invite from Catholic Answers was one of the easiest discernment processes ever, you know, because I was involved in Catholic apologetics in one way, shape, or form from the time I was a law student in 2009 and started a Catholic blog, and then continued as kind of a side project throughout law school, throughout my time as a lawyer, throughout my time as a seminarian. And so it was always this thing that I tried to do at night or on weekends or whenever I had like a spare minute. And, you know, sometimes it would get in the way of the things I was like actually expected to do or getting paid to do or whatever. But it was just like, it was a passion. And so then, 2021 March, I think shortly after you and I saw each other, perhaps, Catholic Answers offered if I wanted to come on board full time. I'd already written a book, Pope Peter, for them. And so I'd done some work with Catholic Answers in the past, but I didn't really know what it was like working for Catholic Answers as an organization. So number one, I mean, being told like, hey, do you want us to pay you and have your full-time job being the thing you do for fun? And it's like your passion project. It's like, obviously, yes. Like, this is no longer nights and weekends. This is now just like your full-time job. Sometimes it's also nights and weekends, but it's, I have much more time to dedicate to it. And hopefully the quality improves kind of as a result of that. So that was amazing. But second, I didn't really know, I guess I didn't know how much I was expected to kind of go into a cookie cutter mold in joining Catholic Answers. But my experience has been the ministry is set up to just say, we want to equip you as best we can. And so you tell us what you're passionate about and we'll find ways of supporting you, which is incredible. I mean, again, like, find yourself a job in whatever field that does that. And you've really made it. Like, you couldn't ask for anything more, where it's just, okay, if I'm passionate about X, they will connect me with the people I need to be connected with. They'll support me. A lot of the behind the scenes stuff, Mike Caprice is here behind the cameras here. And a lot of, thumbnails, audio, video, all that stuff that is sort of taken for granted from the ordinary viewer. I'm terrible at all of that stuff. And so people like that, I have Catholic Answers to thank for it. So it's been really incredible seeing, okay, I understand better what all these different people do and why that's so important for the ministry to be successful.
So in your work, I've seen you on the live show a couple times. I know you do that regularly. You've written books. You're making your own content on Shameless Popery and doing these different things. You get asked a lot of questions. What I want to talk about today, among other things, is the state of Catholic apologetics. Because, I've only been in this world for about 5 years now.
Yeah.
And I'm blown away. And I don't really consider myself an apologist. You know, I'm more of like an evangelist. But I am asked the same questions, I feel like, by non-Catholics constantly.
Yeah.
And sometimes I wonder, haven't these questions already been answered 1,000 times? But, you know, I wonder what that's like for guys who are full-time in the apologetics world. What do you think about that? And are these questions, like, what are the questions that you seem to just run into constantly for people who maybe are like, what are you talking about, Keith?
Where's purgatory in the Bible? No, I think, yeah, you're right. There's a sort of short list that I think most people involved in Catholic apologetics could tell you they get asked a lot. You know, whether it's about Mary's perpetual virginity and the Immaculate Conception, certainly, the Assumption of Mary, papal infallibility. What I find actually very funny is going back and reading like 16th century Catholic stuff, where Catholics were responding to misunderstandings of the Catholic view 500 years ago. And it's like, they said very clearly, we don't believe X that you're saying, we believe Y. And 500 years later, you still have people saying, oh, Catholics believe X and not Y. And it's like, well, we've clarified this several times. I think it's important to remember that it's different people asking. If it was one person asking the same question for 500 years, leaving aside the implausibility of that, then you would just say, at a certain point, you're not asking in good faith. Like, you've asked this question so many times, you've ignored the answer. But so many times, people who don't come from a Catholic background at all, there are certain things that are obvious differences between Catholicism and Protestantism, say. And so those are totally natural questions for them to ask. And hopefully, if you're a Catholic and you know these are the short list of questions I get asked a lot, you've thought about how you want to respond to those questions so you're not trying to come up with an answer for the first time on the spot. So, for instance, plenty of people, whether Protestants or non-religious people or whatever, will say, like, what is the deal where women can't become priests in the Catholic Church?
Yeah.
And I already have in my mind, I had a particular conversation with two young women from Canada, and I explained it to them in a certain way that made sense to them, and they thanked me. They were like, that makes a lot of sense. And so I made a mental note, like, okay, this is the basic format of the answer I'm going to give in the future, unless there's some obvious reason to go a different direction. And then you kind of adapt it for the person you're talking to. But that's the nice thing. Like, I don't think it's bad that the same questions get asked a lot. Occasionally I wonder, like, from a content creation perspective, should I make another video on this topic, or will people find it too repetitive? But frequently this question is coming up anew, and it's worth putting out something that'll cross people's YouTube homepage, where it's a question that maybe you've answered 20 times. Maybe there's 20 videos of you answering it, but they've never seen those 20 videos.
Yeah.
And here's your chance to answer it for them, and they're the ones who need it. Where, sure, maybe people who are like big Nestorians, that's what I'm going to call your fans, big Nestorians are going to say, like, oh yeah, we already know this answer. But the people who need it don't know the answer, and this is your chance to do it for them.
I think that's a great answer. And I've run into that too, where I have to remind myself, this is a different person.
Yeah.
To them, it's the first time. And it's kind of like, you know, a musician who plays the same song every single night, right?
Yep.
And one of my friends is like a big rock star, right? He plays in the Killers. And,
wow.
Yeah. And
I actually, a band I've heard of. That's
we grew up together, and we were in bands together when we were kids, right? And I remember asking one time, like, what's it like to play Mr. Brightside every single night, you know, for every night for whatever. And, you know, when you hear guys like that talk about it, they go, yeah, you know, it's for me, it's old hat, but there are kids in that audience that have never heard this song before, or this is the first time they've ever heard this. And you have to have that perspective. It's like Do
I leave it on anytime it comes on? Yes.
Well,
so,
there you go.
You know, like,
but it's like people's souls. We're talking about people's souls.
Yes,
you know, it's like someone's like got a question, you know, and they want to know the answer. But I guess what I'm curious about is, are you seeing anything new as well? Because you mentioned 16th century. I'm thinking, you know, Francis de Sales talking about, you know, Catholic controversy, the questions he's dealing with. I read that work when I was sort of getting burned out on modern apologetics. I'm like, I'm going to go back and read the OG. And I'm like, this is the same kind of stuff, man. But he had a little bit of an edge to him.
Yeah.
You know, and some of the aspects of that maybe are a little bit different today.
Yep, that's right.
And I think maybe this culture has a little bit of an edge too.
Yeah, I think that's a really good take. So I'd say this, like, just in the time Catholic Answers has been in existence, like when we first started, Carl Keating was responding to fundamentalists who were putting pamphlets on cars in his Catholic church parking lot in Southern California. Like, if you go to Southern California now, I don't think the biggest threat to Catholicism there or anywhere is primarily coming from fundamentalist Protestants. I guess I shouldn't say anywhere. Like, there are parts of the South where that might still be the biggest kind of contender against Catholicism. But a lot of it now is just secularism. It's just don't care about religion, or religion is evil, and don't be religious at all, or be some very do-it-yourself, therapeutic, moralistic, deistic view of God, where God's your butler when you need him, but you can just kind of ignore him when you don't. He just wants you to feel good, so do whatever. You know, like that kind of approach towards religion and towards life has gotten way more popular in our lifetimes.
Sure.
And so you've got more questions kind of coming from that. But I'll say, sort of surprisingly, new atheism is not cool anymore. It's not new, and it's not interesting in the way it was before. You know, 2008, you've got your Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris. All those guys are kind of at the peak of their look at how bad religion is, and it's so terrible, and you've got a lot of really edgy, anti-Christian, anti-religious atheists. And I think now even people who aren't religious find that so cringy that they don't want to be associated with the fedora-wearing, actually atheists at all. And so you're much more likely to get kind of curious skeptics, people like Alex O'Connor, who are just in a different class. Like, they're way more interested in the truth, in my view. They're way more open to the idea that they might actually be wrong about something, and that they could have something to learn from religion, and that they haven't just cracked the code and realized that religion is pointless or evil or whatever. That there's much more of an awareness that there must be something more out there. Because I think in a lot of ways, the New Atheists won, and the world they produced was horrible. They didn't win completely, or it would have been a much worse world.
Yeah.
But I think they've created a crisis of meaning for a lot of, especially younger people. So I think you're seeing a lot of questions coming from a disillusioned post-atheism of people saying there must be more to life than this, but what is it?
So do you think that those questions that come from people who aren't talking about Protestant versus Catholic, they're asking different questions? As a quote-unquote Catholic apologist, do you feel as comfortable fielding those general does God exist questions versus where's purgatory in the Bible?
It's a totally different skill set.
Yeah.
And being totally frank, I'm much worse in my own view at answering the atheist questions for a pretty simple reason. It's much harder to find the common ground to work from, particularly in this kind of format where it's you and a camera and you don't have the ability to check in with the person who's watching. You know, like if I'm one-on-one, I'm happy to do the meaning of life, existence, creator kind of conversations, because I can ask questions and figure out what do they already believe and how can we work from there. And the advantage of Catholic Protestant stuff is, okay, well, both sides have a basic agreement about, you know, the inspiration of Scripture, the person of Jesus Christ, and we have something to build off of to have a productive conversation. And so people will point out, like, why do you focus on Protestants when atheists are much further from the truth? And that's kind of the answer. That when people are, the further you are from the truth, the harder it is to have a generic kind of outreach that is going to touch on the particular place you are and bring you to that next step. Because ideally, one of the things you're doing is taking the person from here to whatever that next step is that God has in store for them. And the more you can kind of address that in a particular way, the better.
That makes sense. When you're talking to somebody about the Catholic faith and they're not like a well-educated Protestant or whatever, they're just asking you general questions about why Catholicism, do you take them on a special trajectory where you say we start here, we move forward? Do you make sure they get this and then move, like, do you have like a step-by-step approach, or are you just fielding whatever question that comes to you? Do you try to take people on a journey, or are you just responding to what they're asking?
It depends a lot on the format and how much time you have with them and kind of the tone of the question and how intellectually curious the person is. Because even if they don't know a lot, if there's someone who wants a deep dive answer, I love giving deep dive answers. Like that's really wonderful. But if it's someone who just has like this one specific objection, then you want to make sure that they feel like their question has been heard and understood and responded to. And a deep dive can come off to those people as an evasion when you're trying to just give the context for it. Because oftentimes people have a surface level question, but the real issue is like several layers deeper. So, somebody says, why do you pray to Mary and the saints? But underneath that is a question about the relationship of prayer and worship. But they haven't noticed that question. Like, do I know what prayer is? Do I know what worship is? Are they the same thing? Are they different things? What's the biblical answer? And so in those, I will often try to tee up that deeper question. Sometimes I'm even asking them a question in response. Like, where do we see worship in the Bible? Is worship the same thing as prayer? That way they're starting to explore those things at a little bit of a deeper level themselves. What I don't want to do with people is drown them in the fire hose, where they feel like that's just a ton of information and they feel overwhelmed. Because that can make them think like, oh, wow, like Catholicism really has substance. But it can also make them feel really sort of disempowered. Like, this is too big for me. I can't handle all this. This isn't for me. And you see people retreat to the sort of like, well, Christianity should be easy. And so that answer sounded too complicated. So I'm going to go with what I know is easier. And so the more you can get people to ask slightly deeper questions, I think the better. Blaise Pascal talks about how people are better persuaded by the answers that they find for themselves than by the ones that you give to them. And so the more you can get people to ask the right questions and come up with those answers themselves, it's much harder to then disagree with yourself than it is to disagree with the person you're talking to.
That is a fantastic point, and I find myself doing that as well. And I'm curious, what are some of the questions that you want them to ask when you're having these conversations?
So it depends a lot on where the person is coming from. I think, we mentioned people who are not religious or they're not Christian at all, we'll say. Getting questions about the meaning of life and like its purpose and how do we know good from evil, like getting the morality questions and the what are called teleological questions teed up is super important. So again, Pascal, he talks about all men are made for happiness. And this is the cause of every action you've ever taken that you have wanted. Now, happiness needs to be understood. They're not in a superficial sense, but like that deep and abiding joy. That every action you've ever made, all of your best actions, all of your worst actions, were made because you thought that they would satisfy you in some way. And it's kind of an obvious point in one sense, but people don't usually think about that. And then you say, okay, so the question isn't, should I want to be satisfied or not? I do want to be satisfied. But some of my actions have satisfied me, at least temporarily, and some haven't. Some have actually hurt me. Sometimes I've done things that have been self-destructive and, they've backfired and they've harmed me or harmed other people. How do I have a roadmap to my own happiness? Now, that might sound very selfish, but part of the answer there is it's actually in being selfless that we find ourselves most contented. This thing that the Greeks called eudaimonia, good-spiritedness, is sort of paradoxically something found by the people who seem the least selfish. They're the most satisfied, whereas the people who are trying to just satisfy themselves unfailingly don't. So getting people to ask those questions are right at the heart of the depths of human existence, and it points to God. Because if God made you in a certain way, like this, if you find like a rock falls and it looks vaguely tool-like, there's no right or wrong way to use that, because the fact it looks vaguely tool-like is it's an accident. It just happens to be that way. So it makes no sense to say somebody's using it well or somebody's using it poorly. It's nonsensical. But on the other hand, somebody who does or doesn't know how to use a wine opener, this is one of those tools I see people sometimes struggle to use. Well, there's an actual right and wrong way to use it. And to know the right or wrong way to use it, you have to understand what it was built for. Well, likewise, there's a right and wrong way of living if and only if you're designed in a certain way. So that question of, the meaning of life is actually inseparable from the question of God. This isn't just this, oh, well, I'll worry about that later with the afterlife. Like, no. Every decision you make from here until the day you draw your last breath is tied to how you would answer the question of whether God exists. And so it makes no sense to put off kind of answering and addressing that question.
What about like a question from a person who is a Protestant?
Oh, yeah.
They have they believe in God, they believe in Jesus, they have a sola scriptura mindset.
Yeah.
What's a question that you would ask them to help them begin to change the way that they understand Catholicism?
There's two places I want to draw that person. And actually the two are very closely tied together, because it's getting them to take early Christianity seriously and getting them to take the Church Fathers seriously. Because when I talk to people who have converted from Protestantism to Catholicism, the number of times it's been some variation of, number one, I started to read the Church Fathers and realized they look nothing like me as a Baptist or whatever. And number two, I wanted to know where the Bible came from.
Yeah.
And those two questions are closely related because they're both questions about the early church. So whatever the topic is, it can be very helpful to say, what did the early Christians have to say on this? And to ask the underlying question, can we trust the early Christians? And we have to make some clarifications there. We're not saying the early Christians are all infallible or anything like that. We're just saying the Holy Spirit has protected the content of Christianity from being irretrievably lost. That there's always recognizable Christianity on earth. And if your view is that all of the Christians we can find are heretics who maybe don't even deserve to be called Christians, if you take the more extreme Protestant view, then you just sort of have to say Christianity failed as a religion. And then it was replaced with this new thing calling itself Christianity like 1,500 years later. That is not an acceptable view for a Christian to take. Like, that's much closer to Mormonism than it is to historic Christianity. And so even questions like, on the question of where does the Bible come from, you're not going to get a good answer for why is this book in the Bible and not that one without having a deeper conversation about how much do we trust the early Christians to get it right. So if you say the things we're looking for are a New Testament book has to be written by an apostolic author, either an apostle or a companion of an apostle. It has to be orthodox in its content. It has to be embraced by the early Christians. It has to have a pattern of ongoing liturgical usage. Those four criteria are often kind of the ones thrown around. The only way you know any of those four is by looking at the early Christians. And if you can't trust them to get this right, then you don't know if you have the right books in your Bible. You just don't. Like, how do I know Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the four Gospels? It's not because anywhere in the Bible tells me that. Nowhere in the Bible even tells me Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All of that is coming from the early Christians. So the more I can get people to ask those questions, the more it changes how they understand Christianity. Because so often there's a popular level of Christianity in the 21st century that is well adapted to our culture and doesn't challenge us in very deep ways, but doesn't look very much like historic Christianity because it looks much more like 21st century culture. I mean, it looks much more like the U.S. in 2025 than it does like, I don't know, Jewish and pagan converts to Christianity in the 100s. Like, that shift is massive. And it's worth getting people to think, is there something we can learn from the Christians who came before us? And I think occasionally you'll have Protestants who really long for something deeper. They want a more transcendent liturgy. They want more history. They want to be more deeply rooted in their Christian heritage. And being able to tap into that and then show, like, these things are available. Like, these resources are there. It can be, I think, tremendously helpful for people on their journey.
So let's talk about resources. A guy calls you or a girl calls you and says, hey, I want to learn about the early Christians. I want to learn about what the Catholic Church, why that's the right church. What are the resources that you sent? And I'm not talking about like super academic nerds that are going to read all about the different councils and things like that necessarily on an in-depth level. I'm talking about sort of the popular level, the person who is the night and weekend person who hasn't devoted their entire life to the study, but is kind of like, this all seems so weird, man. Catholicism?
That's a great question. I think it depends a little bit on the topic. So you can find plenty of primary sources. I mean, you can just find the writings of the church fathers. A ton of them are available in English for free online. You have like Schaeff's Ante-Nicene Fathers and Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers series, which is like this enormous multi-volume series. All of that is available. CCEL, the Christian Classics Ethereal Library, I think is the name, ccel.org, or newadvent.org. Both have like all of those digitized and available online, which is amazing. You also have plenty of books written for a popular audience synthesizing what the church fathers said. So if you don't just want to say like, I want to read, Irenaeus for myself or something, you instead say like, what did the early Christians believe about the Eucharist? Well, like I wrote that book right there. The early church was the Catholic Church, looking at 4 topic areas in particular. Like, what did the early Christians believe about the role of the bishop in the local church? What do they believe about the Eucharist? What do they believe about baptism? And what do they believe about the 4 Gospels? And trying to show the more you read their writings, the more obviously like they just sound incredibly Catholic. I did another book called The Eucharist is Really Jesus that has a chapter in there where I do a much deeper dive just on the Eucharistic theology, because like I'd heard, and this is certainly true, I'd heard that they have a rich theology of real presence, that they make these statements about the Eucharist being the flesh and blood of Jesus, and you have one after another person saying that. And there are some Protestants who say like, oh, maybe it's all a metaphor. Like maybe they don't mean it in a literal way, or maybe they mean something more like consubstantiation or something like this. But when you get into their theology of Eucharistic sacrifice, it's so explicitly Catholic that it's very hard to faithfully say anything other than these guys are Catholic. I mean, they're taking Malachi 1 about the sacrifice being offered from the rising of the sun to its setting and applying it from the first century to the Eucharistic sacrifice. And then you read 1 Corinthians 10, where St. Paul seems to say the Eucharist is a sacrifice in a similar manner to the Jewish sacrifice in the temple or pagan sacrifices to demons. And in all 3 cases, you become a partner in the altar by eating the sacrificial offering. That Eucharistic theology is incredibly rich. So all that's to say, you can find themed books on particular, like those 2 examples from myself. Father O'Connor has a book called The Hidden Manna, which is one of my favorites. The layout of the book is he just goes in order, and he just takes a quotation from the church fathers and explains it. So you're reading them in their own words, and then if you need somebody to kind of walk you through what that means, because sometimes they're saying things in a way that's very confusing, because they're writing to a different audience, and I mean, similar to St. Paul's run-on sentences can throw you, so it helps to have somebody explain what they mean. O'Connor does a really good job in that book. There's a chapter in Return to Rome by Francis Beckwith that has a great short explanation of the church fathers on justification, that people who have the justification by faith alone is like the big hurdle they're trying to get over. There are plenty of Protestants who concede the early Christians didn't believe in justification by faith alone in the way the Reformers do. So even Philip Schaeff, I mentioned a second ago, German Protestant theologian, I think German, he talks about how you're not going to find this article that Luther claimed was the article on which the church stood or fell. You're not going to find anybody in the early church who believes this. Well, if that's true, then there's no church in the early church. And so you can just go kind of topic by topic on those kind of resources. Jimmy Akin has a great book called The Fathers Know Best that is really a compilation thematically. So it's real simple. He just goes with all the major topics that you might have questions about and then compiles what do the church fathers have to say on this. And then I'm blanking on the name of the Bible series. If you look up like patristic biblical commentary series, well, there's 2 things. One, there's a multi-volume series that just goes through biblical passages, which I think is actually a really great way to do this, where it just has, you take Isaiah 7 or something, and you see what all these different church fathers had to say on Isaiah 7.
Oh, that's cool. I love that.
Yeah. I don't think it's cheap. I try to get it on Google Books with the free previews that I can, because it's great resources. And then there's also I have it saved as actually one of my homepage bookmarks, just as patristic Bible commentaries, I think is at least what I have it saved as. I don't know if that's the original name. And it's set up where it searches that Schaaf multi-volume series I was talking about. It searches it by footnote to Bible verse. So every time there's a footnote for, say, Isaiah 7:14, you can just click Isaiah 7:14 and then see every time there's a footnote in there that points to that. And that gives you, it's not perfect, but it's a really good kind of short way to see anytime it gets alluded to or quoted. And it can be very helpful for when you're reading a passage and somebody says it means X and somebody says it means Y, you can look for yourself and say, what did the early Christians think it said? And oftentimes they have very clearly taken one or the other of those views.
Interesting. So there are a lot of resources out there that you can look up. But the thing I noticed that you're talking about has to do with the early patristics.
Yes.
You're sending people back.
Yeah, that's right.
Do you find that there are some people who that's not helpful for? They go, I don't care what these old dead guys had to say. I want to know what in the Bible.
Right.
Because I hear that a lot too. People are like, look, don't talk to me about the early church I had a Baptist guy one time tell me that, the early church was really the Baptist church, the Trail of Blood, and they go all the way back underground, so they look at the early Christians as having been corrupted.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you say to the person who is, they just have the Bible and they go, this is all I need?
Yeah, there's a couple things I try to lead them to. Number one, getting them to realize that other Christians acting in good faith read the Bible differently than they do. And that might sound very basic. That's often one of the hardest steps. Like maybe you think all Catholics are horrible pagans and they're acting in bad faith and whatever, and we need to just leave that on the table. Can we at least acknowledge that, say, your Presbyterian brother reads those passages on baptism very differently than you do? Are they also evil and acting in bad faith? I mean, is everyone besides you just so wickedly corrupt and only you are wise? Like that sort of question, I think is important to ask. Martin Luther, late in his life, talked about how in his younger days he struggled with this nagging thought, are you alone wise? And the thing is, that is a very good question. Like, my man, you are suggesting that basically everyone who came before you is wrong about Christianity and only you have it. Isn't it immensely more likely that you've just misunderstood Christianity? Just have the basic humility to say, if you're in a room and every other student in a class gives A and you put 13, you probably did something wrong. It's probably not that you're so brilliant and only you got it and everybody else is wicked or stupid. But because, Luther starts this. He has this doctrine of the clarity of Scripture called the perspicuity of Scripture. He claims Scripture is all clear and that any ambiguous passages can be clarified in light of clear passages. And what I would push back on is, if that's true, why don't Protestants agree with one another?
Well, I think he was trying to imagine a world where they would.
Right.
I think he was trying to say, and you see this at places like Marburg or whatever, where he's like bringing everybody together to say, all right, guys, we need to get on the same page so that we can take down the evil papists. And I honestly think they thought they could do it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the early stages, I don't think they realized that this was not going to be a one-generation fight. I think the fact that Protestantism has lasted 500 years is obvious proof of its failure, because it's not a reform at this point. You can say we have to temporarily break off full communion because we're trying to reform the church and they're not listening to us. But, think about the Society of St. Pius X. 500 years from now, if they're still not in communion with the church fully, then you sort of have to say, well, it doesn't seem like you've successfully purified or reformed the church.
Yeah.
You can understand the desire, but at a certain point, you've just set up shop outside. And so it is, I think, completely reasonable to ask someone who calls themselves Protestant, look, the idea of the reformers was to reform the Catholic Church.
See, I think what I was going to say was that you said, I thought it was interesting, the fact that Protestantism still exists showed that it fails. I would say the fact that Catholicism still exists showed that it failed.
Very true.
Because they weren't, in their minds, saying we're starting a new thing.
Right.
They were saying that old thing is corrupt and useless and evil, so we are freeing ourselves from the evil parts of the church and restoring what God originally intended, which if that were the truth, then, what does Jesus say? The branches that don't bear fruit get cut off and thrown away and withered. And the fact that Catholicism certainly hasn't been cut off and withered, you know, whereas Protestantism has, I don't know that I would say it's cut off, but I would say effectively in some sense, because it's so divided that you can't even point to one root anymore.
I would give this test. Gamaliel gives this in Acts, where he talks about the different messianic movements at the time of Christ, and how the other ones, when the leader died, they would shatter. They would either completely dissolve,
that's true,
or they would split off into a bunch of different movements. And so the oneness of the Catholic Church, which Protestantism can't colorably claim to have for itself, it does not have oneness in any observable sense. Like, you can't even, like, we've got a Catholic Creators Conference right here. I think Luther tried to do the same thing with Reformers conference, and it didn't exactly go well.
Yeah, they were excommunicating each other.
Right,
you know?
Exactly. So there is a oneness. For all of the infighting you might see in the Catholic Church, there's a visible oneness that is a hallmark of divine unity, because God is one. And you don't see that in Protestantism. You don't even really see that in Orthodoxy. You have enough schisms within Orthodoxy between like the Russians and the Byzantines, obviously the Oriental Orthodox and the Eastern Orthodox. Like, you don't have the same kind of oneness. So, like, if someone said, I'm going to be Catholic, you know what they mean. If they say I'm going to be Protestant, you've got a lot of follow-up questions. In fact, if they say they're going to be Orthodox, you have to say what kind.
Yeah.
And that has a difference of which communion you're going to be a part of. With Catholicism, there's one communion. And that is the way the early church undeniably is set up. Like, if somebody in the first century said, I'm going to be a Christian, there was one visible Christian communion. And I mean, certainly there were Gnostics and things who would call themselves Christians, but they weren't recognized as Christians by the Christians. They were recognized as outsiders, and partly because, as Ignatius points out, they didn't have the Eucharist. You know, his letter to the Smyrnians, chapter 7. So I would say, you kind of see the fruits of it in that sense. But yeah, like, I don't think the Reformers intended to create the denominational situation that Protestantism finds itself in right now. And it doesn't seem like they have a mechanism to solve the problem that they have. Like, let's acknowledge, however many denominations there are, I know there's a big debate about exactly how many denominations there are and what we mean by denomination and all of that. However many there are, Protestantism has way too many denominations, and that number seems to be going up instead of down, and they don't seem to have a mechanism that can turn the ship around as it's going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and I've heard from plenty of people who try to spin that as though it were a positive. Oh, well, the multiple denominations just helps us to reach more types of people.
Multiplication by division, right.
Exactly. I think one of the questions that is important when I think about those fundamental questions to ask people, and you kind of are at the heart of this, you're at a deeper level than I am with it. I just ask the question, who's in charge of your church and why should we trust them?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
And when they say to me, well, Jesus is in charge of my church, I'm like, that's not true. You know, I mean, if Jesus were literally in charge of your church, like, take me to him so we can talk to him and have him sort out these questions. Like, ask them like the literal question, who is in charge of your church?
Yeah, that's right.
And why should we trust him? And it's because all these things that you're talking about, they come down to authority. They come down to authority. And we have this presupposition that, and I agree with it, that the early Christians, they're trustworthy because they were closest to that original deposit of faith. So what they did and what they said should matter to us, you know. And if we're so far away from that, who's wrong? Yeah,
and especially if we have problems that, like, if all the Christians of today agreed on a certain thing, then we can say, well, look, maybe we don't need to listen to the early church. It's so clear that X is true. We all agree on X. When we don't agree on X, when we have like wildly different answers to every X you could think of, then maybe we need to say, okay, which of us is the deviation from the historic Christian view?
Yeah, that's interesting.
You know, like, that's a good way to frame it, because it at least means, like, the thing I find really strange is I hear regularly from American Protestants that, oh, this is really easy. If you just knew the meaning of this Greek word, it just means obviously X. Like, baptizo means immersion, therefore baptism has to be by immersion. And then you read the Greek-speaking Christians of the early church, and that they didn't only do immersion baptisms from the first century. And it's like, oh, did they just not know Greek as well as you do? Their native language.
They
and
spoke it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like they're speaking Koine Greek. You've read about it in a book. Like if somebody said like, oh, Joe, I don't speak English, but I read about it in a book. And let me tell you, you're using English wrong. I'm dubious. I'm dubious of that because it's my native tongue. Now, it's not impossible, but if every English speaker, you're going to tell them that they're all doing it wrong because English means something else, you're having a laugh. Like that's just not plausible. So yeah, I think like a lot of the normal arguments we hear on biblical interpretation, like, oh, the Greek just means this, just poetic concordance, or it's translated this way, or any of those things. We need to say, okay, but what did it mean to the people who spoke the language and lived in the culture and in some cases knew the apostles? Because that's a hard burden to overcome, in my view.
I agree. Let's talk a little bit about some of the newer questions that you see coming your way. Where does Catholic apologetics as a whole need to go in the future? Like in the next 3 years, what do you hope to see apologists doing that they're not doing now?
That's a great question. I have a big vision for Catholic Answers, and I also have a lot of questions, we'll say, about the way things like ChatGPT and AI more broadly are going to impact. Because a lot of the historic role of a Catholic apologist is sort of just the informational response. Somebody says, hey, I heard you guys worship Mary. Is that true? And if so, why? And you can say, no, we don't. And here's the distinction between honor and worship. And, it's okay to honor. You're supposed to honor the emperor. St. Peter says that. You're not supposed to worship the emperor. He got killed for not doing that. So Peter clearly had to distinguish between Dulia and Latria. Like honor and worship aren't the same thing, and we're to do one and not the other. So you can do all that. But ChatGPT can do a lot of that. And right now, it's not super accurate. It regularly gets things wrong. But there are programs and initiatives that I think are getting better, like Truthfully and these others, where they're using artificial intelligence to give coherent and even persuasive defenses of Catholicism. And I don't think that gets rid of the human role, but I think it changes the human role. So positively, I try to make use of ChatGPT. One of the other tools, when we were talking resources, it didn't even occur to me to mention this. I will often type in like whatever question, like how do the church fathers read Isaiah 7:14 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
I don't just take ChatGPT's answer because it is wrong a shocking number of times where it'll just literally make up quotes. But I will ask it for sources, and then I'll try to track down the sources and see if the sources actually say that. So it doesn't get rid of the research burden, but it can speed it up, where it can mean like, okay, I'm going to go look this up and see if this is true. And people are going to be better and better about using that, especially I think younger people. Now, again, we're going to have a new problem created of people blindly trusting when they shouldn't. But as these models get more accurate, they're going to become, more trustworthy and rightly so. There's going to still be the need for an individual human encounter. Like a machine can't take that away. So I think the human, the personal element will become more obviously important. So compare Augustine's Confessions and the Summa. ChatGPT at a sufficiently advanced state will be able to do something like the Summa, presumably. It'll never be able to do the Confessions, even if it imitates the style. It can't do a heartfelt pouring out of one's vulnerability before God because it doesn't have a heart. And so what Augustine is able to do by sharing his personal witness and story in a way that's theologically deep, not just emotionally rich, that is a uniquely human thing. Whereas like a Thomistic, let's just give you all of the different definitions and answers to the question, I think machine learning is going to be able to do a lot of that.
So where do you see the place for guys like you and Catholic? So your big vision for Catholic Answers.
Oh yeah.
Is it in a sense to create some kind of trustworthy GPT? And if it is, because here's what's happening in my brain right now when you talk about that. I go, oh great. Now we're going to have Protestant GPT and Catholic GPT. Because I see that in my comment section on YouTube right now. I will see anti-Catholics that clearly type in some sort of question, and I get this clearly Chat GPT, Protestant, anti-Catholic answers, just and I'm going, well, I could do the same thing with the Catholic thing. And like, how do we solve that?
Yeah. I think there's a lot to that.
And is that what you're talking about with Catholic answers?
I think, well, I don't think that's going to, I don't want it to replace me, obviously. But I think we're going to have to recognize some of what we do. People will start turning to machines to do it. And I think we're already seeing that begin. And so we don't want to be blind to it. But I think we have to change. So one of the things we can do is just evaluate. Okay, Protestant GPT will tell you this. Catholic GPT will tell you this. Here's how we know who's right and who's wrong. I don't love that part of the future. I think that's going to be part of the future to come. In the same way that you might have to evaluate two different news stories now and say, well, this one's biased and wrong and that one's not.
I just had a complete explosion in my brain, Joe. And, maybe I should do this, maybe you should do this. But we need to have like a Protestant GPT and a Catholic GPT debate each other.
Yes.
And it's like, and do it up. You know what I mean? It's like boom, 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 boom. And I mean, that's my fear, honestly, is that it's going to become so automated that the human element is taken out of it. Because like you talked about, you can give facts, you can spin facts, but you can't look somebody in the eye and ask that deeper question about what is the meaning of life and then respond to that. So
this is the peril and the opportunity. That the more we go down that rabbit hole, the more we become isolated from one another. Yeah. And there is already a deep and aching loneliness and loss of communion. And so one of the things that individual Catholics can do, and more broadly Christians can do, is be a witness to authentic human connection. Yeah. So things like, your conversion story. ChatGPT can't do that. And those kind of things are incredibly powerful because it speaks on that human-to-human level. That has been very difficult historically to do with new media. Like being able to have an authentic interpersonal encounter where I'm on one side of a camera and I have no idea who's on the other. Maybe nobody, maybe a million people. Yeah. Like that's hard to do. But the more you can bare your soul in a human way and speak to how God has impacted you, I think the better. Like I mentioned Augustine's Confessions, your conversion story, Scott Hahn's, Rome Sweet Home. I think a lot of the most persuasive things we have are these kind of personal testimonials. And I think there's a huge role for that. I think there's also a big role for unique takes. So an analogy or an angle on something that nobody has thought of. A language learning model isn't equipped to come up with a clever new way of approaching a problem because it's doing really advanced linguistic completion and prediction. And so you being able to use human ingenuity to approach it with a new analogy or idea or something like that can be incredibly helpful. So some of the, if you think about it this way, already within our jobs or our roles, in some way this is just a human experience. There's a data gathering portion, and then there's an analysis portion, and then you draw conclusions from it. The data gathering, ChatGPT is going to get very good at. The analysis part, it's mediocre at. You can tell it to analyze it in one way or another, and it's not particularly reliable. It can form a conclusion, but you can kind of have it say whatever you want it to say. But the more it does the data gathering, the more room there is for you to do like a smart analysis of it. But I think that there's going to be a renewed sense of the importance of, as I said, the personal witness, and then also spirituality, because those are going to be things that are uniquely human in such a way that they can't be replaced by a machine, and that people are going to have an aching longing for the more that they're isolated in front of a screen, not interacting with real people very much.
So do you see then the role of the apologist becoming more of a listening and reacting versus just a pushing out of information to try to understand where people really are and hear the question behind the question and the heart behind that person? Because like you said, ChatGPT can't do that. They can't tell, well, this person's question about Mary worship is really about a misunderstanding of what worship actually is.
Right. I think, yes, to an extent. The other thing, I want to caveat everything I've said for the last several minutes by saying, in a way, a lot of this could be asked like when Google came on the scene 21 years ago. Suddenly, all of the world's books are available at your fingertips in a way they hadn't been before. And this has been incredible from a Catholic Apologetics standpoint. There's a book by, I want to say his name is Archibald Alexander from the 19th century. And he claimed that all of these early Christians endorsed the 66-book Protestant canon. And I was reading it my first or second year of law school. And I started to read the Church Fathers and see how they used, the Deuterocanon and everything else. And I read this and thought, I don't think any of this is true.
Wow.
Because he mentions like Augustine endorsing the 66-book canon. That's
not true.
And Augustine very famously endorses the 73-book canon, I think in City of God. He's also president of the Third Council of Carthage, which endorses the 73-book canon. He quotes the Deuterocanon quite a lot. Like, he very clearly is not in that camp. So I just went and used Google and tracked down every source Archibald Alexander claimed endorsed the 66-book canon. And there were maybe two, Jerome and Rufinus. And even they are complicated cases. And none of the other ones had a 66-book canon. They might have had a shorter canon than we have today. But you could just do the data gathering much more easily. Like if someone reading that in the 19th century had to take the guy's word for it. And he was lying or wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
Someone today can do the legwork, but here's the catch. Most people don't. Like, I spent a few hours tracing all these sources. And it would have taken weeks in the past. It took me a couple hours. ChatGPT might be able to do it in a couple seconds, but people still have to actually do the work, and most people aren't going to do it. So the other thing is, like, people will continue to ask questions that the answer is very easily out there, and in one sense, your role as an apologist gets a lot easier because you're just like, oh no, here you go. Here's 1,000 things written on this that are now at my fingertips. So I think that's going to be part of it as well. Like, even though in theory everybody could do the data gathering themselves, what I know of human nature is they're not going to in many cases.
I mean, when you talk about human nature, there's more to it than just I need the facts. There's how do you interact with those things and what's going on in your own heart as you interact. Where are you closed off to the truth? Because I think that's when you talk to a lot of people who have converted, what you hear isn't just, well, I thought X was true, but then I found out that it was false. Therefore, boom, I became Catholic.
Right.
There's a whole lot of interplay between a person's head knowledge and what's going on in their heart and their own personal journey with the Lord. And I think that apologetics needs to do more than just push the facts out. It needs to help that person on that. It's almost like your bedside manner as a doctor. You provide the medication, but you also have to help the person in their humanity deal with that. And I think that's one of the things that I see separates good apologetics from bad apologetics is the bad apologetics wants to make everything about the argument. The good apologetics wants to make it about the person.
There's an example I like to go to from Scripture. In John 11, with the death of Lazarus, when Jesus is approached by Martha and then he goes to Mary, in both cases, the women say, I want to say verbatim the same thing. Lord, if you'd been there, my brother would not have died, or our brother would not have died. And the difference is, when Mary says it, she's weeping. And when Martha says it, it's like a theological objection. And so to Martha, Jesus explains that he's the resurrection and the life. He gives a theological answer to the theological question she's asking. Mary is having a personal crisis, and so Jesus cries with her. And so ChatGPT can sort of do the Martha one. It can't do the Mary one, and it can't tell the difference between Mary and Martha. And so you as a human being should be able to see the person behind the question and then give them the answer that they need, which might not just be dumping facts on them.
So hard to do on the internet, though, isn't it, Joe? It's hard to do. And I know on a call-in show, because, I've done those too, and it's you have 8 seconds to answer a giant question that this person's been gearing up to ask you for so long, and then you don't get to look them in the face, and it's difficult to do that. But I think that we have to just find solace in the fact that it's not all about us, and we just might be one piece of that puzzle that God is putting together to help that person come to the faith. That there may be somebody in their life that's going to sit down with them, that they're going to say, man, I called Joe Heschmeyer and here's what he said, but I wish I could have asked him that. And the other person might be able to say, well, let's talk about that. Yeah,
that's exactly right. I'm reminded of a thing Rodney Stark talked about how when people convert, he applies this to what he calls new religious movements like the Moonies and the Mormons, but he also argues this is true of early Christianity. that even with groups that are very small in terms of the overall population, conversions often happened when people had several different ties to the network of Christians or Mormons or whatever. That it's not just, as you say, it's not just a matter of head knowledge. These propositions are true, therefore I'm going to become Christian. These propositions are true, therefore I'm going to become whatever else. That it's much more, I find myself in a situation where everyone I know and love is a Catholic, and that makes Catholicism seem more credible to me. That the people I look up to and admire seem like they're living very holy lives as Catholics, so therefore I trust Catholicism. Whereas if everyone you know as a Catholic is like a flagrant hypocrite and horrible sinner, you're going to say, I don't really trust this. Now, you can say that's good or bad, but that is deeply embedded within our nature as humans. That one of the things we do is we look at the proof in action. If the person giving you diet advice looks like they are in horrible physical condition, you're going to take all of that with a grain of salt. Maybe salt's bad for you, I don't know. Because you're just going to say, well, it doesn't seem like you know what you're talking about. And maybe it's just that they haven't followed their own advice. Maybe their advice is great, and they just don't follow it. But it's like this with holiness as well. You look to, does this person seem to be putting these principles in action, and are they making them a saint? And if the answer to that is yes, then you want to convert. So in a way, our job is easier and harder. Just be a saint. And even if you're not great at answering questions on the fly, you do have the fact that, like, in the future, that will become easier, where you can just pull out your phone and say, ChatGPT, where do we find in the Bible XYZ, or what's the history of this doctrine, and probably get a nice jump start to an answer. The thing you can provide, whatever your state in life, whatever your intellectual knowledge, whatever any of those things, is the credibility of being able to provide a defense for the hope that lies within you. Now, by definition, what 1 Peter 3:15 and 16 is talking about isn't you being able to answer every question somebody can ask on a call-in show. Like, that's fun. I love doing that. But what I am accountable for, and what you're accountable for, and everyone watching this is accountable for, is what are your reasons? And you need to know what those are, and nobody else can give them to you, because that's something deeply personal. And that witness, I think, is going to become more and more important in an obvious way. And I'm already seeing that, I think, becoming more prominent. You look at somebody like Lila Rose. Some of the time she'll have episodes that aren't obviously on, say, Catholic topics at all. But everything she does is as like a faithful, devout Catholic. And that is itself an incredible witness. So even if somebody's like, I'm not a Catholic, but I really like her on health or politics or whatever, can then say, like, oh, wow, these people I really look up to and admire in the public space, and hopefully the people I really look up to and admire in my own life are these devout Catholics. That makes Catholicism more credible before you utter one argument. It gives you such a better position to present the truth of the gospel.
That's huge. That's huge. All right, I've got two questions for you as we close here.
Let's do it.
And it's kind of on that human aspect of it, but what's the hardest question that you've ever been asked, or what's a question that when it comes to you, you just go, man, this one is tough to give a good answer to?
Yeah, the one that I've always struggled with is, why does God create people he knows are going to go to hell? And I don't think we have the tools to give a completely satisfactory answer, because there is something mysterious about this, because it gets to the heart of the mind of God, which is something that we don't know well. We know what God has chosen to reveal to us, and we don't know what he doesn't. I don't know why I do the things I do, and I've got a very finite mind. Being able to know the infinite mind of God, so many things would have to be true. I'd have to know, who is going to hell, and what were the other possible worlds in which God could have created some other situation. And I have access to literally none of that. There's a preacher, I don't know if you ever heard of him. His name's Tim Keller.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so Tim Keller.
Redeemer in New York.
Yeah, he's passed away. God rest his soul. He shared in a sermon one time, he was talking about that question about why would God create people that go to hell?
Yeah.
And he says that question is a uniquely Western question, because he says that we are the ones who struggle with the idea that God could punish someone forever in hell. He said in other parts of the world where they live under horrible, evil, oppressive destruction, they struggle with how could God ever forgive anybody?
Yeah.
So how could God forgive someone who has been so evil and hurtful? So it's interesting how our culture sometimes can shape those questions that we ask.
It's true. I mean, because, you're right. We're constantly asking, why do bad things happen to good people? And when you read the Psalms, they're like, why do good things happen to bad people?
Exactly.
Exactly. Why do the wicked prosper? And you're just like, oh, yeah, I guess this is a first world problem.
Yeah.
That I'm not worried about the wicked prospering because I'm very comfortable and complacent. But at the same time, like, I don't want anybody, even the wicked, to go to hell for all eternity, and God says he doesn't.
We know that God says he doesn't want that, but I think it's a great question. Yeah, that's interesting. And along that lines, kind of thing I wanted to end with was, we talked about the human aspect of it. Just for you as a guy, as a Catholic man, you live in this world of apologetics all the time. You've got apologist brain, I'm sure, which everything you look at probably is like framed with around, facts and arguments and all of that. How do you keep your faith in Christ from becoming just simply about arguments and facts?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I love that you're ending with that question, because I think that's one of the major challenge any of us have in this. And I would say not just people who make apologetics content, but a lot of the people who consume it as well. Like, many of us are drawn to this because our minds work in a certain way. And there's a lot of benefits to that. I like having an analytical brain. I like wanting to go deep in understanding the facts and everything on whatever question. And I think it's a gift, but it's a gift that has drawbacks, which include, when I'm reading scripture, am I just listening to what God has to say to me? Or am I just saying, oh, this will make a good rebuttal to this objection somebody asked me 5 weeks ago and they might ask me again? And so there's a few things I do. If it comes up in prayer, if I'm reading scripture or doing the office of readings or something like this, I will often jot it down. Because I find that if I try to just ignore it or put it away, I'll either forget it and that'll drive me nuts, or it'll nag at me the entire time I'm praying and that'll drive me nuts as well. But if I just make a little mental note, or like just a physical note, like write down, if I'm on my phone, I'll take a screenshot so I can go back to it and hopefully be prompted again of whatever it was that prompted me that time. Or I'll just physically write down whatever it is. And then I can hopefully just wave that away and kind of move forward. Because you're right. Like, it can't just be, how can I get things for other people? Actually, when I first met you, I was doing faith formation for teachers in the Catholic schools. And one of the big problems that we routinely had was the teachers had this incredible heart for their kids. But when they would get this stuff for their own faith formation, they would immediately jump to, how can I use this in the classroom?
Yeah.
And that's actually really good. Like, if only more Catholics said, how can I share this with others? And they're already at that step. But we have to stop them and say, that's good, but you first need to receive it. Like, you cannot give what you don't have. So you need to be formed by this and shaped by this before you're ready to give this in a pat answer to a question a seventh grader has. And the same thing is true from an apologetic standpoint. That, I would say it like this. My relationship with my wife, it would be a real problem if I didn't bother to know anything about her. If, I couldn't say anything about what she likes or doesn't like, or if I knew none of that, that would be a huge red flag for the relationship. But at the same time, my relationship with my wife is not reducible to me learning facts about her, because I could do that about anyone living or dead.
Yeah, you got to know her.
I got to know her, not just about her. That's it. And man, I came back from a Steubenville teen conference, whatever, many years ago. And one of the kids on the bus on the way back said, before this, I feel like I knew about Jesus. Now I feel like I know Jesus. And
man.
That is it. That's it.
Yeah.
And so being able to keep those things distinct in your mind of, if I'm next to you and I'm just thinking in my head, I have more facts about Keith, am I missing my chance to actually encounter you because I'm encountering an idea of you? And that's what you always have to go beyond that to encounter any other. And this is most true in your relationship with God.
Yeah. So what do you do personally? What's helpful to you, Joe?
Yeah, I think being able to relate at the level of the heart, which is not my natural disposition. Like, this is something I've been working on and trying to grow in, just being vulnerable before the Lord and just really presenting the question, like, what do I need to share with God? What do I need to ask for? What am I hoping to receive from him? And those, like, just being the patient rather than trying to be the physician. Because it's very easy to say, oh, this other person I know needs this, and I can take this to them. Okay, but what do you need? And then just stopping every time I start to go into that mode and kind of representing that question. I'm not great at it. I mean, frankly, like, this is an ongoing thing I have to work with. And I just find the more time you put into it, the more you can have those moments. Even if, let's say you have 15 minutes of prayer and 10 minutes of prayer, you're getting distracted. Whether it's distractions by things of your day or by angles you can take on a thing or anything like that. But if those 5 minutes are worth it, that can make all the difference. I had this time when I was 23, I think. So it was like 17 years ago. I was in Washington, D.C. I was living there at the time, and I did a holy hour. And I want to say I was in the National Basilica, but it is busy, and it was noisy. And it was hot. It was like just hot enough that it was like uncomfortable in a way you notice. And for literally the first 59 minutes of a holy hour, I found myself distracted and uncomfortable and frustrated and fighting that and fighting that and fighting that. And there's this great book by Dom Eugene Boylan called Difficulties in Mental Prayer, where he talks about how much that pleases God because you're making an act of the will to focus on him rather than just experiencing the high of whatever he wants to give you. That this is often the most pleasing prayer to God, but it does not feel like that when you're doing it. It feels like a waste of time. And I was looking down at my watch and just like sticking through it. You know, I did not want to be there because I was so frustrated. It was hot. There were too many people. People were being too loud. It was a great preamble to marriage and kids, you know, where you just like never get the kind of peace and quiet you might think you want or need. And so what? So I stuck it out, and literally the last minute of the holy hour, I had this tremendous rush of peace and a great vision of kind of what I was meant to do and what the future was going to hold in a certain way. And I can still remember very clearly like the nature of what it was. It was a really good 60 seconds in the course of an hour. And the rest felt like, it wasn't, but it felt like a total waste. So I'd just say, if you find yourself in that situation, just stick with it and don't give up on the fact that like you have that difficulty. Boylan says, like, if you could see the recording angel tallying like your actions in prayer, the prayer that to you felt really good might have been worth very little because you were just coasting on good feelings. Whereas the prayer where you were constantly distracted and turned your attention back to God is you making repeated, deliberate acts to choose God over the distraction.
That's such an important point. I talk to people about the rosary so often who say that, and they're like, oh, does it count? Because I didn't feel it. And I'm like, it counts twice. Yeah. Because you yourself weren't consoled in that. Yes. So you were consoling God by your suffering. And I mean, it's you know, kind of a misuse of the word suffering, but your effort to pray, just out of love for God and duty to God, without receiving anything that you're intangible in that moment. That's part of it, man.
There's times in marriage, I'm sure both you and your wife could attest to this, where you do things because the other person wants it. They want to have a conversation. They want to go do an event. They want to do something else. And it's not what you would choose at all. But you do it hopefully not begrudgingly, out of love for them. And the more they, you know, you're not trying to show them. They kind of know, like, this wasn't your first choice, but you did this because you loved me. That means a lot on a human level. And you have to assume there's a similar thing to God where, just doing the thing I wanted to do anyway. Like whenever my wife is pregnant, she wants the kind of junk food I like to eat. She'll be like, I really am craving buffalo chicken. And I'm like, look, honey, I'll be a good husband. I'll go get it. Yeah. Because, you know, if I have to. Yeah. Like, I don't think she thinks I'm a martyr in those situations because it's just giving me permission to eat the stuff I shouldn't be eating in the first place.
I think that's not a bad analogy, Joe, because I think that sometimes the things that the Lord wants us to do, you know, he knows what makes you tick. Yeah. Right. And he's not a masochist. He's not trying to hurt you. He's not trying to say, all right, well, you don't like mental prayer. I'm going to just make you do. Like,
right.
I think he puts you in places where he knows you're going to thrive because he created you for that.
Yeah.
So he's going to steer you in that direction. So the thing that you're like, okay, I'm really excited about this. That's what he's going to put you in, you know? 'Cause he gave you that heart.
But there are these other times where he's going to put you in somewhere that makes you grow. And it might feel like a failure because you're not swimming in your natural sea.
Right.
But it's the thing that he knows as a good father you need to grow in, and he's going to let you have some growing pains because you need it. And so don't feel like that's a waste or a failure. You know, like I've got a 5, 3, and 1-year-old, and they deal with discouragement when they don't immediately tackle some new skill and succeed. Like there's some stuff they immediately take to it, they're really good at it, and there's some stuff that is hard at first. That's all of us. And as a dad, I have to be like, no, you have to stick with this. This is really good for you. You can't just give up on this thing you're working on because it's hard. Mm-hmm. Like you are made to do hard things is the thing we constantly tell our kids. But we're also made to do hard things. Not in like a sadistic sort of way, but in a way where it's like we're capable of doing difficult things for God, but we have to get in the habit of voluntarily taking a certain number of difficult things on, or we're going to live life on just like comfortable mode. I regularly think of, I want to say it's homily 25. It's one of St. John Chrysostom's homilies where he's talking about Peter denying Jesus 3 times. And the second and third denial are, well, Peter is warming his hands by the fire. So Peter, the night before, or earlier that evening, I should say, had said he was going to be martyred for Christ. And now he can't even have cold hands. That's not looking good. If you can't do small, difficult things, you can't do big, difficult things. So maybe prayer is one of the small, difficult things God has given you. Praise God. Because that's making you more of the saint he wants you to be.
Yeah. Wow. Joe, one more question.
Yeah, let's do it.
What's coming up next for you? What are you working on? You got another book coming down the pike? You got
I have ideas for books.
I know you're killing it on Shameless Popery right now, so you're doing that, but
I have several things I want to do and have had a lot of trouble kind of making the time for it. The one book that I am probably the closest on is one exploring 4 ways that St. Thomas Aquinas says we can grow in wisdom. Like just look at Thomas Aquinas' own life, the way that he wasn't initially recognized as being someone smart or wise, but it was because he was listening. And we often want to look smart, and so we jump in too quickly with answers. But actually listening and absorbing all of this and then slowly like meditating on it, seeking out knowledge and all of that, that is the actual key to growth and wisdom, so that when you're ready to share, you got your ducks in a row. And so I don't know exactly I'm trying to figure out how to frame that in ways that people will want to actually pick it up because I find it really interesting, but that doesn't mean 3 other people do. But it's something that is near and dear to my heart because you just think, all right, how did this guy become the brilliant master that he was? And Thomas is asking that same question about Jesus and looking at the boy Jesus growing in wisdom, in knowledge, in favor of God and man. That, like, what does that look like for our Lord to grow at a human level? And what can we take from that? So that's one of the things I'm hoping to kind of get some work done. We'll see kind of how long it takes me to do or if it ever sees the light of day.
Well, I'm sure that it'll be awesome.
Thanks.
Just like everything else you've done. I can't tell you how many times I've recommended the early church was the Catholic Church to people. It's at the top of my list on books I send to people that are questioning me about Catholicism or wanting to learn more about it because it's so succinct and it's just right there.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Keep up the great work, Joe. Thanks for taking time to sit down with me.
My pleasure. What a joy.
It's been an honor, and I hope we get to do it again sometime soon.
Well, thanks.
All right. God bless you, brother.